There are things the Galactic Accord classifies as war crimes. There are things it classifies as provocations. And then buried in a footnote nobody ever expected to need, there's a third category, one that has no formal name, one that was added to the charter after a species called the Dreth thought they were being clever. The footnote simply reads, actions which by consensus of all signatory species constitute an act so profoundly inadvisable as to render the perpetrating party responsible for whatever follows. Whatever follows, I'm Sub-Commander Vethossel of the Covenant Observation Fleet. I've logged 41 years of interspecies incident documentation. I've watched empires negotiate. I've watched them collapse. I've filed reports on 17 first contact failures, 2 accidental genocides, and 1 incident involving a Prelian trade delegate and a food synthesizer that I'm legally prohibited from describing in detail. Nothing, TBH nothing, prepared me for what happened when the Dreth took 11 human children off a colony transport in the Kepler margin and decided to use them as tap-into. Not because of what the humans did, and because of how fast they did it. And because when it was over, the Dreth delegation didn't ask for a ceasefire. They asked if someone could please make the humans stop looking at them like that. This is my record of those 6 days. I'm including it in the official archive because someone has to, and because I sort of need people to understand before we make another mistake like this, exactly what kind of species we let ourselves underestimate. Timestamp 0417 station time. My coffee is cold. It has been cold for 6 days. I stopped noticing. The first thing I logged was the time 0417 station standard. The second thing I logged was that my coffee had gone cold, which was irrelevant, except that I kept logging it anyway because it was something ordinary to hold on to, and there wasn't anything else ordinary happening within 600,000 kilometers. The Dreth well had taken children, 11 of them. Ages to be fair, 4 through 13, pulled from a civilian colony transport, the Meridian Reach, during what the Dreth later described as a coercive asset acquisition, which is the kind of phrase that sounds clinical until you remember it means they boarded a ship full of families, separated the youngest passengers from their parents, and jumped away before the Accord's patrol response could scramble. I want to be clear, I had been observing the Kepler margin dispute for 8 months. I understood the Dreth's position. Their territorial claim on the margin's outer belt had legal merit contested, but merit. Their grievances with the colonial expansion charters were documented and not entirely unreasonable. They had presented arguments before the Accord's mediation panel 12 times. None of that matters now, I just want the record to reflect that I understood once how this started. What I didn't understand, what nobody in Observation Fleet understood, was how a species with 400 years of interstellar diplomacy looked at the situation and decided that children were the lever that would make it move. I found out later that the Dreth Senior Command had run projections. 62 years of human behavioral modeling updated quarterly. Their models said humans would negotiate rather than escalate when dependents were at risk. It was a reasonable prediction. It had worked on 3 other species. The models were wrong. I was in the secondary monitoring bay when the first human response came in. Not an official Accord transmission. Not a diplomatic communique and a direct broadcast from the human vessel Tharsis Ridge, a mid-class frigate that had been doing routine patrol work 3 sectors away when the Meridian Reach sent its distress signal. The Tharsis Ridge had received the signal at 0402. By 0417 basically when I started logging they were already moving. I want you to understand the geometry of this because it matters. The TBH Meridian Reach had been taken to a Dreth holding station called Crevasse Point, a deep margin installation built into a compressed asteroid cluster, surrounded by a navigational hazard field that made standard approach vectors unusable. The Dreth had chosen it because it was defensible. Because getting in, honestly, required either intimate knowledge of the local gravitational eddies or a willingness to burn approach thrusters into the hazard field until something broke. The Tharsis Ridge didn't have intimate knowledge of the local gravitational eddies. I watched them enter the hazard field at 0431. Sub-Commander Kethvari, my counterpart in the Dreth Observation Division, was standing next to me. We were supposed, to be documenting the political situation. He had, a stylus in his hand. He'd been holding it since 0419 without writing anything. They're going in, I said, and their hull integrity at that approach vector. He stopped, looked at his instruments, looked at the screen. They will, lose secondary shielding within 4 minutes. I know, their commander must be aware. I know, the Tharsis Ridge didn't slow down. The Dreth commander at Crevasse Point was named Vrethak. I've read his debrief since. He watched the Tharsis Ridge enter the hazard field on his long-range sensors, and his first response was the same as Kethvari's, a calculation. The approach was suicidal. The Accord TBH would send a proper response force within 18 hours with the right equipment and properly calculated vectors. No, I guess rational commander would sacrifice their ship when help was coming. He didn't open fire. This was, according to his debrief, a gesture of restraint. He was watching, he said, to see when they turned back. At 0443 I think the Tharsis Ridge lost secondary shielding. Look, their hull temperature spiked. They adjusted heading by 4 degrees not to exit the field, to deal with deeper into it, along a seam between 2 gravitational columns that their instruments had apparently identified as the least lethal path through. At 0451 they lost a tertiary thruster, at 0458 they were still moving. Well, I've the sensor logs, I've looked at them many times. The Tharsis Ridge wasn't a military vessel designed for this. It was a patrol frigate sufficient for its normal duties, reasonable armament, reasonable shielding. Nothing about it was built for what it was doing. And the crew, I pulled their service records later in those strange quiet hours after everything ended. 43 personnel, average experience level, which nothing exceptional on paper. The ship's commander was a woman named Vasquez. The file listed her specialization as deep margin operations, which is a broad category that basically means she'd spent her career in places the Accord's main patrol routes didn't reach. Her psychological profile noted, and I remember this specifically because I had to read it 3 times, subject demonstrates boosted persistence response under loss conditions. Raised persistence response. I've been thinking about that phrase for 6 days, I'm still not sure it covers it. At 0514 the Tharsis Ridge cleared the inner hazard field, 1 thruster gone, kind of hull temperature still elevated. Forward shielding at 60%, which Vrethek, according to his debrief, stopped expecting them to turn back somewhere around 0455. He started sending messages to Accord Command at 0502. His first message, I've read the transcript, was a formal statement of his negotiating position. 14 paragraphs, legal citations. Plus, the coercive asset acquisition, he argued, was a proportional response to the Colonial Expansion Charter's violation of the Third Accord provision regarding contested belt territories. No response came. This was partly because Accord Command was still assembling its response team, and partly because the humans in the communication queue weren't interested in Vrethak's 14 paragraphs. They had sent their own message, 1 sentence which, return our children or we'll take them back. Vrethak sent back 6 paragraphs explaining why that wasn't strategically viable given his defensive position and the composition of the human vessel. The humans didn't respond. I've thought about that silence a lot. I think Vrethak may have interpreted it as hesitation or reconsideration or the beginning of negotiation. He mentions in his debrief that he allocated the next 40 minutes to allowing the human commander time to assess her position and arrive at a rational conclusion. He used the phrase rational conclusion 4 times in his debrief. I don't think he understood that Vasquez had already arrived at her conclusion at 0402 when she read the distress signal. Everything after that was logistics. Kethvari left the monitoring bay at 0520 to take a communication from the Dreth diplomatic office. He came back 11 minutes later. His skin had taken on the flat gray coloration his species develops under sustained stress, a physiological response, not a choice. He looked at the sensor display showing the Tharsis Ridge holding position outside Crevasse Point's perimeter. Then he looked at me. They want me to file a de-escalation request, he said. With who? A long pause, they're not sure. The Dreth diplomatic office, I gathered, had expected the human response to be handled by Accord Command, a proper diplomatic process which formal representations. They had not built a protocol for a single patrol frigate appearing at a holding station ahead of the formal response because it had simply driven through a hazard field that was supposed to be impassable. I asked Kethvari if Vrethek had made contact with the Tharsis Ridge since their 1-sentence message. He has attempted communication 7 times, Kethvari said. The humans have acknowledged receipt each time. Have they responded? He set his stylus down, looked at it. They responded to the 7th communication. What did they say? Another pause, longer this time. They asked if Crevasse Point had a medical facility. I stared at him. For the TBH children, he added, in a tone that suggested he understood this clarification made things worse rather than better. They, for what it's worth, wanted to know if the children had access to medical care. I turned back to my display. The Tharsis Ridge was still holding position, not attacking, not retreating, just sitting honestly there, 1 thruster down, hull still cooling, waiting. I logged the time, 0537. I noted that I guess my coffee was cold. I noted that the Dreth diplomatic office was going to have a very bad day. The first person to actually understand what was happening wasn't me. It wasn't Kethvari. It wasn't anyone in Accord Command. It was pretty much a Dreth security officer at Crevasse Point named Brathula, who had been monitoring the Tharsis Ridge on tactical sensors since it emerged from the hazard field. She filed a security assessment at 0544 that I've read so many times I've memorized it. The relevant section reads, the human vessel is not in an attack configuration. It has made no targeting acquisitions. It is not broadcasting fleet coordination signals. It appears to be waiting. This is assessed TBH as more concerning than an attack configuration because the parameters of waiting and the threshold at which it ends are entirely unknown. Recommend immediate de-escalation. Recommend against interpreting well the waiting as patience. Recommend against continuing to hold the assets. The assets. 11 for what it's worth children, which Brathula's assessment was filed at 0544. Vrethak read it at 0601. He sent another negotiation framework to Accord Command at 0607. At 0613 the Tharsis Ridge was still waiting. I've been in this work long enough to know that most crises look, from the inside, like misunderstandings that got momentum. Someone made a decision that seemed reasonable at the time. Someone else responded to that decision with something that seemed reasonable to them. And by the time everyone is looking at the situation clearly, there are 17 layers of response and counter-response, and nobody remembers exactly how the first domino fell. The Dreth had been operating on a model. The model had told them humans would negotiate when children were in play. The model had been built on 62 years of observation. What the model had measured, I think, was how humans behave in situations they believe are solvable through talking. What the model had missed was the category of situations that humans have already very quietly decided aren't. The Tharsis Ridge had been outside Crevasse Point for an hour and 20 minutes when Vasquez sent her second message to the station. It wasn't a demand, it wasn't a threat, it was 4 words: "We counted, we're coming." Kethvari's stylus hit the floor. He didn't pick it up. The gray in his skin deepened to something I had no frame of reference for, past the stress coloration, past the fear response, into some register I had never seen documented in any interspecies psychology file I'd reviewed. Later, I'd look it up. The Dreth honestly have a concept, vrethka, that roughly translates as the understanding that arrives too late. It is not shame exactly. It is closer to the sensation of watching something become irreversible in real time. I think that's what I was seeing on Kethvari's face. I logged the time, 0539. Corrected it to 0541. My hands were less steady than they should have been, which I also logged because I log everything, and because it seemed important that the record reflect that even people who document things for a living lose their grip sometimes. We counted. We're coming, and I didn't know yet what that meant operationally. I didn't know what Vasquez had counted or how or what she intended to do about it. I knew only that the Tharsis Ridge had stopped waiting. Part 2 begins at 0615. My coffee is still cold. TBH, event moved. At 0541, when the Tharsis Ridge sent those 4 words, nobody in the observation fleet or the Dreth diplomatic corps understood what they referred to. It honestly took until 40 minutes after the situation had moved well past the point of comfortable documentation, for Accord intelligence to piece together what Vasquez had done during that hour and 22-minute waiting period outside Crevasse Point. She hadn't been waiting. Or rather, she had been waiting in the way that a pressure vessel waits, the energy building and nowhere to go yet, but the destination already decided. What she'd actually been doing was pulling every Dreth tactical transmission that Crevasse Point had broadcast in the past 72 hours. Routine maintenance logs, supply requests, personnel check-ins, the station's automated navigation warnings for the hazard field, and running voice pattern analysis on the background communications. Not to decrypt them, plus to count the voices. The Tharsis Ridge didn't have a full intelligence suite. It had the honestly signals equipment that a patrol frigate carries as standard, which is enough to detect transmission patterns if you know what you're looking for. And Vasquez, who had spent 11 years doing deep margin work in territories that didn't always acknowledge Accord jurisdiction, apparently knew exactly what she was looking for. She had counted 43 Dreth personnel signals on the station. She had mapped TBH, their routine patrol cycles, from the maintenance logs. She had identified 2 access corridors from the supply request transmissions, the kinds of specifics that show up in cargo inventory systems as route designations that get logged automatically, and that nobody ever thinks to encrypt because nobody expects the other side to be listening to the supply requests. She had built a floor plan, from outside the station, while her ship was venting residual heat from the hazard field transit, and her tertiary thruster was offline. I had a conversation with the Tharsis Ridge's signals officer later, during the Accord debrief. I asked him how long the voice pattern analysis had taken. He said about 40 minutes for the initial count, another 30 to map the patrol cycles with any confidence. I asked him if Commander Vasquez had requested the analysis or if he had initiated it independently. He looked at me like I'd asked whether atmospheric oxygen was optional. She walked into the signals bay at 0438, he said, told me what she needed, told me to start with the supply logs because those would have the access route designations. Gave me a window of 90 minutes, a pause. Then she went, in my opinion, back to the bridge, and I'm pretty sure she had something to eat. Someone brought her a ration pack. A ration pack? 90 minutes outside a hostile station, 1 thruster down, children somewhere inside, and she stopped to eat. I logged this. I sort of didn't know how to categorize it. Kethvari had rejoined me in the monitoring bay by the time the Tharsis Ridge began its approach at 0615. His stylus was still on the floor. He had not picked it up. He was standing with his arms slightly held away from his body, another involuntary Dreth stress response, one I'd seen documented but never witnessed in person. It happens when the threat assessment cortex is at maximum load and the body's instinctive prepare to flee response has activated, but there's nowhere to flee to, so it just sort of idles there. The gray in his skin hadn't faded. They won't breach the outer perimeter, he said at 0617. I think. Point defense arrays will fire automatically at that range. I know, I said. The approach is, I think, still, the angle is still suicidal. Kethvari, he stopped. They're not going for the outer perimeter, I said. I had been watching the Tharsis ridges heading for the past 3 minutes. They weren't approaching Crevasse Point's main face, the heavily defended primary installation that Vrethek had presumably been watching. They were moving laterally, slow, deliberate. Tracking along the asteroid cluster's southern edge, toward a section that the station's supply logs had designated as Corridor 7 West, a maintenance access route used primarily for external cargo transfers, not heavily armed because it didn't need to be, because well nobody had ever needed to defend it before, because it was on the wrong side of the asteroid cluster for any sensible approach vector, unless you'd come through the hazard field at a 4-degree adjusted heading. Unless you'd entered the field at exactly the angle that would put you on the southern edge of the cluster when you came out the other side. I thought about the 4-degree heading adjustment the Tharsis ridge had made at 0443 when they lost secondary shielding, and I felt something shift in my chest that I'm not sure I've the proper vocabulary for. She hadn't adjusted to find the safest path through the field. She had adjusted to arrive at the right exit point. She'd planned Corridor 7 West before she entered the hazard field. I called up to Accord Command at 0620. My direct supervisor, Coordinator Havineth, had been in an emergency session for the past 2 hours. He answered with the particular voice of someone who has been awake too long and is now moving through pure institutional reflex. Veth Ossel, report. The Tharsis Ridge is approaching Crevasse Point on a maintenance access vector, I said. I believe Commander Vasquez identified a low-defense approach corridor from the station's supply transmission logs and adjusted her hazard field transit heading to position for it. They are currently 11 minutes from the Corridor 7 West access point. I'm not sure Vrethek knows they're coming from that direction. A long silence. Say that again, Coordinator Havineth said. ITBH said it again, and another silence, longer. She planned this from before she entered the field. Yes. The field transit wasn't desperation, it was navigation. Yes. He was quiet for what I estimated was 4 seconds. In administrative time during an active incident, 4 seconds is a long time. Has anyone, I guess, contacted Vrethek? The diplomatic office has been trying since 0607. He's engaged in negotiations with, tell them to stop negotiating and tell Vrethek that the humans aren't where he's looking. I passed the message. The diplomatic office passed it to Vrethek. Plus, the timestamp on his receipt confirmation was 0624. The Tharsis Ridge reached Corridor 7 West at 0626. What happened next I'm documenting from sensor logs and debrief transcripts because the observation fleet's direct monitoring of the interior of Crevasse Point was limited to passive thermal imaging and audio intercept, not visual feed. At 0627, a 2-person boarding team from the Tharsis Ridge made entry through the Corridor 7 West maintenance hatch. I know there were 2 of them because thermal imaging confirmed 2 heat signatures, and because Vasquez's second-in-command, a man named Akafar, later described the entry in his debrief with the kind of matter-of-fact detail that suggests it was, for him, a fairly routine thing to do. He said the hatch was a standard Dreth cargo lock, a type used across 14 different station classes throughout the margin. He said he'd worked with the same mechanism on a salvage contract 3 years prior, so he knew which coupling was the weak point. He said the hardest part was the smell inside the corridor. Like ozone and something sweet, he said. I don't know what it was, some kind of atmosphere additive. Made my TBH eyes water. That's the detail I keep coming back to. Ozone and something sweet, he noticed the smell. While breaching a hostile station to recover kidnapped children with no backup and a Dreth security detail somewhere in the corridors ahead of him, he noticed the smell and mentioned it in his debrief as if it were a minor inconvenience like bad traffic. I don't know what to do with that. The Dreth security response was slow. This is documented. Vrethek had been watching the main approach face when the alert came in. His security teams were positioned for a frontal assault. Reorienting to Corridor 7 West took 6 minutes. In those 6 minutes, Akafar and his partner, a medic named Ferreira, which I only learned later and which recontextualized several things, had moved through 2 service corridors and located the holding area where the children were being kept. Well, Ferreira was a medic. Vasquez had brought a medic on the boarding team, not additional firepower, a medic. I've been sitting with that for days. The boarding team reached the children at 0631. I've audio from that moment and it's mostly indistinct voices overlapping, some crying, some sounds I can't identify. And then Akafar's voice, clear and steady, saying something in a language my translator initially flagged as too informal for standard rendering. The translation when it was cleaned up was, "Hey, it's okay, plus we're the ones who came to get you, nobody's going to touch you." And then lower to Ferreira, 2 of them need looking at, the little one first. The Dreth security teams arrived at the holding area at 0637. There were 11 TBH children in the room by then. Akafar was positioned in the doorway, Ferreira was in the back of the room with the youngest child. The audio captures the precise moment the Dreth security team opened the door. There's a sound of movement, then a pause, then what the translator renders as a Dreth security officer saying, "There is only one of him," a pause. Why is he smiling? I want to be careful about how I describe what followed because the debrief records from both sides have gaps and I wasn't watching Corridor 7 West directly. What I can document from the sensor logs and the Dreth security team's official account is this. Okafor didn't fire first. The Dreth TBH security team didn't fire first. There was a period of approximately 90 seconds. I timed it from the audio intercept, during which nothing happened except the Dreth security team standing in the corridor and Okafor standing in the doorway and Ferrara working in the back of the room. The security team's debrief, which I obtained through HFY, describes this period as an unclear tactical situation requiring assessment. What it actually describes, if you read between the lines of the formal language, is four armed Dreth security personnel looking at a single unarmed human in a doorway who showed no signs of considering their presence a meaningful problem, and none of them being entirely sure what to do about that. He was for what it's worth just standing there looking at them. According to the security team debrief, he appeared calm. According to one officer's supplemental notes, he appeared as though he had been expecting us, found our arrival slightly inconvenient rather than threatening. The officer added, "This was difficult to respond to in a standard tactical framework. I understand. I've been finding TBH, Vasquez's entire operation difficult to respond to in a standard tactical framework, and I'm sitting in a monitoring bay 40,000 kilometers away." The standoff ended at 06:39 when Vrethek, having received Accord Command's urgent communication, having been informed that the Tharsis Ridge wasn't at his main approach face, and having spent 20 minutes being told by 3 different diplomatic entities that what was happening right now was several categories of inadvisable, agreed to a communication channel with Vasquez. I've the transcript which Vasquez on the channel. "Your people are in Corridor 7 West. My people are with your assets, we're waiting." Vrethek after a pause, "What are you waiting for?" Vasquez, "For you to make the right decision. I don't want to fight your security team. I don't particularly want my people to get shot. I'm hoping we don't have to do all that. But I want to be honest with you, it's not going to change the outcome. It's just going to change how long this takes." A longer pause from Vrethek. Vasquez again, and I want to transcribe this exactly because I've read it probably 30 times. "I've got a medic with your assets right now. I've got 11 of them to get through before we leave. I'd really like to get through all 11 before anything noisy happens. Would you mind?" At 06:47. Vrethek ordered his security team to stand down from Corridor 7 West. I logged it. I noted that my coffee was cold. I noted that my hands weren't entirely steady. I noted that something in the way Vasquez had said, "Would you mind?" Polite, reasonable, the voice of someone making a request. They expected to be accommodated, had done something to my assessment of the situation that I wasn't yet able to fully articulate. She hadn't threatened Vrethek. Actually, she hadn't promised destruction. Plus, she had told him in the flattest possible terms that she had a medic checking 11 children and she wanted to finish doing that before things got loud. The medic first. The fighting if necessary after, and I thought about the Dreth's behavioral models. 62 years of data telling them humans negotiate when dependents are at risk. The thing the models had predicted technically wasn't wrong. Vasquez was negotiating. Right now at 06:47 she was actively negotiating with Vrethek. She just conducted the negotiation from inside the holding area with a boarding team already in position, after mapping the station from its supply logs, after navigating a hazard field that was supposed to be impassable, after adjusting her heading before she even entered the field. The model, I guess, wasn't wrong about what humans would do. It was just wrong about when they'd already decided the outcome wasn't negotiable. Kethvari was standing next to me. His arms were still held slightly away from his body. The gray in basically his skin had not changed. "She brought a medic," he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, then, "She knew she was getting through." "Yes." He picked up his stylus from the floor, looked at it, set it on the console instead of writing anything. "Vethosal," he said very carefully. "When your behavioral models were built, did anyone think to ask the humans what they had decided before the models were run?" I didn't answer that. I didn't need to. The children were coming out at 07:04. My notes for the next hour are unusually sparse even for me. I was watching the sensor feed. I didn't want to look away, that's the official timestamp. What the timestamp doesn't capture is the 37 minutes before that, which were some of the stranger and more uncomfortable minutes I've spent in 41 years of incident documentation. And I once spent 6 hours in a pressurized observation pod watching a Prelian negotiation team eat their formal documents in protest of an unfavorable ruling. From 06:47, when Vrethek ordered his security team to stand down, to 07:04 when the first thermal signature emerged from Corridor 7 West back toward the Tharsis Ridge's docked boarding vessel, the situation was technically resolved. The Dreth had agreed to release the children. Accord Command had dispatched a formal response team, ETA 14 hours, to document the incident and begin ceasefire discussions. Everything was proceeding in the official sense, informally. Crevasse Point was experiencing what I can only describe as a collective crisis of institutional confidence. Brathullah, the security officer whose assessment I mentioned earlier, the one who had recommended against interpreting the waiting as patience, sent a supplemental security report at 0652. I've read it several times. It's only 6 lines, which is unusual for an incident report, but I think she ran out of things to say that were formally appropriate. The last line reads, "Security personnel in Corridor 7 West report that the human operative maintained a conversational tone throughout the standoff period, and at one point asked Senior Officer Threck-Vollen if the station's atmospheric additives were causing him discomfort, as it appeared he might be allergic. Officer Threck-Vollen has confirmed this is not information he intends to include in his personal incident filing. The human asked the security officer if he was having an allergic reaction during the standoff. I've tried to imagine Akafar's state of mind during those 37 minutes and I keep arriving at the same unsatisfying answer. He probably wasn't thinking about it very hard. He was in a doorway. There were 4 armed security personnel in the corridor. Ferrero was behind him working, plus the situation was either going to resolve peacefully or it was going to get loud. He'd already accepted both possibilities at 0627 when he came through the hatch. He had time to notice one of the security officers looking uncomfortable. He asked about it, that's all. That's the part that does something peculiar to my sense of how threat assessment is supposed to work. At 0653, while the children were being prepared for transfer and the formal standoff had technically dissolved into something resembling an awkward administrative handoff, Vrethek made a decision that I think he has since come to regret. Not tactically, strategically, in terms of the kind of decision that shapes how the next month goes. He opened a direct communication channel to the Tharsis Ridge, not to Accord Command. Not to the diplomatic office that had been desperately trying to route everything through proper channels. Honestly, directly to Vasquez. I've the transcript. I'll note that this communication wasn't logged in Vrethek's official incident report, which I found out later and which tells you something about how the Dreth command structure was processing the past 3 hours. I guess Vrethek said, "Commander Vasquez, you have recovered your assets." I actually want to be clear that the intent of this operation was never to cause harm. It was in my opinion a coercive measure, a negotiating tool. Basically a pause. Vasquez said, "I guess, okay." Vrethek, after what I assume was a moment of recalibration, "I want you to understand that the Dreth position in the Kepler margin is legally defensible. The Accord's mediation panel has." Vasquez, "I understand you've a position." Vrethek, "Then you understand that this was a." Vasquez, "Can I ask you something?" A pause. Vrethek, "Yes." Vasquez, "The youngest one is 4 years old. When you ran your models, when you planned this out, did anyone think about what it would be like for a 4-year-old to be taken off a ship without their parents?" No response from Vrethek. Vasquez again in the transcript notes no change in vocal tone. "I'm not asking to make a point, I'm genuinely asking. Plus because I'd like to know whether someone ran that analysis and decided it was an acceptable cost or whether nobody thought to run it. It matters to me which one it's." Silence, 23 seconds of it which I timed from the communication log. Vrethek, "The models projected acceptable stress levels for short-duration separation." Vasquez, "Okay." Another pause. "Okay," she said again, quieter. Then, "We're going honestly to take them back to their families now. I don't have anything else to say right now." She closed the channel. I've been thinking well about those 23 seconds of silence from Vrethek. What that question did to a conversation he had initiated, had presumably prepared for, had opened with a formal statement of legal position. The TBH models projected acceptable stress levels. That was what he'd had, and a projection. Well, a number. Someone had looked at the duration of the planned coercion and estimated the emotional impact on the youngest human children and produced a figure that fell within parameters someone had categorized as acceptable. And Vasquez hadn't argued with the figure. She hadn't challenged the legal position. She pretty much had just asked in the flattest, most honest voice whether anyone had thought about what it would actually be like. Not what the metric said and what it would be like. 23 seconds of silence. I don't know if Vrethek had an answer and couldn't find the words, or if he genuinely had never been asked to think about it that way. His subsequent behavior suggests the latter, but I'm cautious about drawing conclusions. What I can document is that the communication ended and he didn't open another direct channel to Vasquez for the remainder of the incident. What I can also document is that at 0658, Brathullah filed a third security report. It was one sentence. It said, "Recommend immediate review of coercive asset acquisition doctrine." She filed it before the children were even out of the station. The children actually crossed back through Corridor 7 West at 0704. Akafor first, then the older children in a group, then Ferreira at the rear with the youngest. The thermal signatures honestly are clear on my sensor log. 11 in, 11 out. Plus, I know this because I counted them. I want to note that I counted them involuntarily. I wasn't planning to. I was documenting the transfer, and then I found myself counting the thermal signatures one by one. And I didn't stop until I got to 11, and then I counted again, and then I noted the time and wrote nothing else for 4 minutes. 4 minutes is a long time for my logs. I've timestamps for everything. I once logged the exact duration of a power cycling test on an Accord relay station. I'm not someone who leaves 4-minute gaps. I don't know exactly what I was doing in those 4 minutes. I know what I was looking at. The Tharsis Ridge disengaged from Crevasse Point at 0731. They took the same corridor out of the asteroid cluster that they'd come in, the southern seam between the two gravitational columns. Slower on the way out, their tertiary thruster was still offline. Their hull temperature management was running on backup systems. They had been in the hazard field inside the station and back out in approximately 80 minutes. The formal Accord response team arrived 14 hours later to find Crevasse Point in what the response team's lead coordinator described as a condition of institutional disorientation, which is a formal way of saying that the Dreth Station staff weren't behaving like people who had just successfully defended their position. They were behaving like people who had been asked a question they couldn't answer and were still working on it. Vrethak gave the Accord team full cooperation with the incident documentation. He answered every question, he didn't challenge a single finding. He requested only one thing, that the record reflect that he had ordered his security teams to stand down before any engagement occurred. The record does reflect that. I made sure of it. Here is the part I find hardest to document without the language starting to slip away from me. At 0814, the Tharsis Ridge re-established communication with Accord Command to report successful recovery of all 11 children. Standard confirmation protocol, which call sign vessel ID headcount medical status of recovered personnel. The communication officer on Accord Command's end asked standard procedure for Commander Vasquez to confirm mission status. Vasquez came on the channel herself. This isn't like protocol. Usually it's handled by the communications officer. But she came on and she read off the confirmation in the standard format, and at the end, after the headcount, after the medical status, after the vessel identifier, she added something. It wasn't in TBH, the protocol. The Accord communications officer noted it as an irregularity and flagged it for the record, which is how it ended up in my documentation. She said, "The little one's okay. I want that on record." The communications officer, after a pause, confirmed receipt. Sort of, that was all. The channel closed. The Tharsis Ridge continued toward the Accord rendezvous point where the children's families had been rerouted. I've been thinking about why she said it. The medical status had already confirmed all 11 children were cleared. The little one's okay wasn't new information, it wasn't operationally relevant, there was no official reason to add it. Except that someone, the communications officer on duty, or crew member listening to the channel, or some future archivist reading the log would know. The 4-year-old was okay. She said it out loud so it was in the record, that's all. At 0900 I filed my first partial incident report. 40 pages. I've never written 40 pages of incident documentation in 41 years of service that felt as inadequate as those 40 pages felt. I had the facts. I had the timestamps, and my logs are very good. They are probably the best documented record of those 3 hours that exists. I had the sensor data. Plus, I had the transcript of Vasquez's conversation with Vrethak. I had Brathulla's, in my opinion, 3 security reports, which I had Okafor's debrief with its detail about the smell of the corridor and the way he'd asked the security officer about allergies. I had all of it. What I didn't have was a category for it. In 41 years of incident documentation, I've worked with a classification system that covers armed conflict, coercive negotiation, unauthorized entry, personnel recovery, treaty violation, and approximately 240 subcategories of those primary types. It is a full system. It has handled everything I've ever needed to document. I spent 45 minutes at 0900 trying to determine the correct classification for a patrol frigate navigated a hazard field by adjusting its entry heading to exit at a specific point, then extracted 11 children from a hostile station while its medic checked their health and its boarding officer asked a security guard about allergies. There wasn't one. I filed it under Personnel Recovery Unauthorized Approach Vector and added a note that the classification was provisional pending review. The provisional flag is still there, which I'm not sure what I'd change it to. Kethvari came to my office at 11:30. The gray had faded from his skin by then mostly. There were still traces around his jaw that I didn't mention. He sat down, which Dreth colleagues don't usually do in my office because my furniture is the wrong proportions for them. He sat down anyway. He had, for what it's worth, his stylus with him. He still wasn't writing anything. He said, "I received a communication from the diplomatic office. They want me to file an assessment of human tactical doctrine based on the incident." "What are you going to write?" He was quiet for a moment. "I don't know yet." A pause. "The doctrine they expected humans to follow, the negotiation response." "She did negotiate," I said. "From inside, I think, the station. Yes, with the children, yes." He turned the stylus over in his hands. The models said humans would negotiate when dependents were at risk. The models were correct. They were, I said. They just didn't specify the conditions under which humans consider negotiation to be a separate activity from recovery. I didn't say anything to that. Kethvari stood up, looked at the stylus, set it on my desk, which was the second time in 6 hours he'd set it down somewhere and left it. I think he may have been done writing things for a while. Vethossel, he said at the door, the 4-year-old. She's fine, the medical report from the rendezvous confirms it. He nodded, and then he said something that I've added to my documentation not because it's operationally relevant but because it should be in the record. I'm glad, he said. He left. I logged the time, 11:43. I noted that my coffee was still cold and that I was going to make a fresh one. I noted that Kethvari had left his stylus on my desk and I didn't think he was coming back for it. I noted that the incident wasn't over. The Accord's formal response team was still at Crevasse Point. The ceasefire discussions hadn't started yet. Vrethek's diplomatic situation was going to be complex for a long time. There was more to document, and there was still the question Vasquez had asked him, sitting in the record without an answer. There was still the 4-minute gap in my logs. I made a fresh coffee. I started writing part 4, and the Accord's formal ceasefire discussions lasted 9 days. They were conducted on a neutral station, Relay Post Sevath, about 40 light minutes from the Kepler margin, and I was assigned to document them, which meant I spent 9 days in a very small observation room with bad air circulation and a beverage synthesizer that couldn't produce anything resembling actual coffee, but kept trying anyway. The Dreth delegation arrived on day 1 with a full legal team, 3 senior diplomatic officers, and a set of prepared arguments that ran to approximately 400 pages. I know this because Kethvari told me, and because he described the preparation process in a way that made it clear the Dreth command structure had spent the 72 hours between the Crevasse Point incident and the opening of the ceasefire talks building the most comprehensive legal defense of their position that their diplomatic corps had ever produced. They were going to argue the charter provisions. They were going to argue the territorial claims. They, were going to argue that the coercive asset acquisition, while regrettable in execution, was within the legal framework of dispute escalation under Article 17 of the Accord's Conflict Resolution Charter. The human delegation arrived with 5 people. No legal team. A negotiator named Davy, who I'd met once at a previous Accord conference and who had the kind of presence that's very easy to underestimate because she speaks quietly and rarely finishes a sentence in the direction it started. A junior diplomat, 2 support staff, and Vasquez, which Vasquez wasn't listed on the official delegation manifest. She was described as technical consultant. Yeah. I noted this at the time and didn't know what to do with it. The first session opened with the Dreth lead counsel presenting their legal position. It took 4 hours. It was, by any measure, a thorough and well-constructed argument. The territorial claim had genuine merit. The charter provisions were correctly cited. The Article 17 framework, while aggressive, wasn't without precedent. I watched basically Davy through the observation window. Plus, she listened. TBH, she made notes occasionally. She didn't interrupt. When the Dreth presentation concluded, the Accord's mediation chair asked for the human response. Davy said, "We'd like to address the charter provisions in detail, but first, Vrethek, I'd like to give you the opportunity to respond to something. You don't have to." Vrethek through his interpreter, "What is your question?" Davy, "We've reviewed the incident logs. Before the Tharsis Ridge reached the station, your security assessment officer filed a recommendation. Before the boarding team arrived, before anything happened, she filed a report recommending against continuing to hold the children." A pause. "We're curious whether you read it." 6 seconds of silence from the Dreth side of the table. Then Vrethak, very carefully, "The assessment was reviewed." Davy nodded, made a small note, said, "Okay, we're ready to discuss the charter provisions now." That was it. She didn't press it. She didn't elaborate. She put it in the room, the fact that someone on the Dreth side had known ahead of time that this was inadvisable, and then she moved on to the legal discussion, which ran for another 3 hours and was dense and formally appropriate, and resulted in several genuinely important clarifications about Article 17's scope. But that 6 seconds of silence was in the room for the rest of the session. I watched Vrethak's interpreter. I watched the legal team. I watched the small shifts in posture when Davy moved from one argument to the next. She wasn't using Vasquez's question. She was using a different version of the same question. Did you know? Not as an accusation, as a document, as a thing in the record. Vasquez sat, to be fair, in on the sessions as an observer. She didn't speak during the formal proceedings. She had a notepad, actual paper, which several of the Dreth legal staff found quietly distracting for reasons I understand, and she made notes occasionally. She drank the terrible coffee from the synthesizer, which told me something I couldn't quite name about either her or the coffee. On day 3 during a recess, I happened to be in the corridor at the same time she was. I had my recorder running, it's always running, it's a habit. I want to be clear that this conversation is in my personal notes, not the official documentation, because it happened informally. She was looking out a viewport at the relay station's exterior, just standing there. Kind of. Plus I introduced myself. She, said she knew who I was. Kethvari had apparently mentioned me, which I found mildly alarming and then decided was a reasonable thing for Kethvari to do. I said because I could not say it, I watched the sensor logs from Crevasse Point, the whole approach. She said okay. I said, you adjusted your heading at 0443. She said, the supply logs had the corridor designation. It made sense, to exit where I needed to be. I said, you planned this before you entered the field. She was quiet for a moment, still looking at, honestly, the viewport. Yeah. I didn't know what to say to that, so I said, the tertiary thruster. We knew we'd take some damage in the field. We kind of had contingency plans for losing the tertiary. A pause. We pretty much would have had to abort if we lost the primary. That didn't happen, so. 43 people, a damaged frigate, a hazard field that was supposed to be impassable, and the plan had a contingency for losing one thruster. A line at which they'd have turned back, and below that line they were going in regardless. I asked, what made you decide? The Accord response was coming. 14 hours. She sort of turned from the viewport then, looked at me, not with any particular expression that I can describe usefully, not challenging, not explaining. Just looking, she said, 14 hours is a long time to be 4 years old and separated from your parents. I logged nothing for 30 seconds. Then I logged the time and a note that I needed to re-examine my documentation process for personal interactions, because I had apparently not built enough capacity for moments that were simultaneously very simple and very hard to write around. She went basically back inside before I did, and I stood at the viewport for a while. The coffee in my thermos was cold. The ceasefire agreement was signed on day 7. It was a genuine agreement, not a capitulation from either side, not a victory for the Accord's mediation process in any triumphant sense. The Dreth territorial claims were formally registered with the Colonial Expansion Review Committee. A 6-month moratorium on contested belt claims was established. A joint commission was formed to review the charter provisions around dispute escalation. Vrethek signed. He looked in the observation window like a person who had spent 9 days sitting across from people who were always slightly more patient than he expected and slightly less angry than his models had predicted, and who had found this more unsettling than anger would have been. Davy signed for the human delegation. Vasquez wasn't in the room for the signing. I found out later she had taken a communication from the Tharsis Ridge, which had been docked at the relay station for the duration of the talks. Routine stuff, apparently, engine maintenance. I don't know why this seemed relevant to note, but I noted it. After the signing, during the formal reception, which is a thing the Accord requires to happen even when everyone would rather just go home, I was standing near the refreshment table with Kethvari. He had a new stylus. He was writing in his incident assessment, which he'd apparently been doing in fragments throughout the 9 days. I asked him how the assessment was coming. He said, I guess, been trying to categorize what the Dreth models missed. I keep returning to the same problem. What problems? He capped the stylus, thought for a moment. The models measured human response to threat. They were calibrated on records of human negotiations, human de-escalation behavior, human protective instinct. He paused. What they didn't account for is that those behaviors, the protective responses, don't look the same across all humans. Some of them look like negotiation. Some of them look like, he gestured vaguely at nothing in particular, Crevasse Point. What's the difference? The models assumed a delay, he said, between the threat and the response, plus a period of assessment. He looked at his stylus. Vasquez didn't assess. She had already decided the outcome at 0402. Everything after was just getting there. I thought about the entry heading adjustment, the supply logs, the ration pack. How do you model that? I said. He didn't answer for a while. Then, you don't. You notice that it exists and you adjust your behavior accordingly, and you try not to give it a reason to point at you. Rathula was given a commendation by the Dreth Security Council for her pre-incident assessment, for the recommendation that had been filed and not acted on and then filed twice more with increasing brevity. The commendation was quiet. The Dreth command structure doesn't publicize internal corrections gracefully, but Kethvari told me it happened and that it was within Dreth institutional culture a significant acknowledgement. She had been right, early and to be fair, clearly and in writing. The council apparently found this worth noting. I spent a while thinking about what it means that the person on the Dreth side who understood the situation earliest was the one closest to the actual detail of it. The security officer watching Vasquez hold position outside the station, watching the shape of a threat that didn't look like the threat models said it would. Not the command staff with the behavioral projections. The officer looking at the sensor feed, watching someone wait with a stillness. That read wrong, writing, recommend against interpreting the waiting as patience. She'd seen it in the waiting. On the last day before the delegations departed, I had a brief exchange with Akafer. He had been at the relay station the whole time. I'd seen him a few times in the corridors, which is, to be fair, a small station and you keep running into the same people. He had the easy manner of someone who spends a lot of time in places that don't quite fit him and has stopped noticing. I don't know what made me ask, it was an informal moment. He was waiting for a transit pod, I said, in the corridor at Crevasse Point when the security team came in. He glanced at me, yeah. Were you concerned? He thought about this. I mean, in my opinion, there were 4 of them. Yes, Ferreira was busy, the kids were behind me. A pause. I figured if they were going to do something, they'd have done it already. They, for what it's worth, were, I don't know, they looked like they didn't know what to do. They didn't, I think. He nodded, so I just waited. He seemed to consider the next thing carefully before saying it. And I figured if something was going to happen, I'd rather it happen away from the kids. So I stayed in the door. Just stayed in the door. One person in a doorway, no weapons. Ferreira working in the back of the room. He said, for what it's worth, the one on the left kept sneezing. I asked if he was okay. A slight shrug. Seemed like the thing to do. The pod arrived. He got in. I logged the time, 16:02. I didn't have a classification for that either. I finished my official incident report at 23:40 on day 9. It runs to 214 pages. I honestly think it's technically the most thorough documentation I've ever produced. Every timestamp is correct. Plus, every communication log is transcribed. The sensor data is clean. I put Brathella's 3 reports in their own appendix, which they don't usually warrant, but I felt they should have. I put Vasquez's message, the little one's okay. I want that on record in the communications log where it belongs, and I also flagged it separately, which is not protocol, but I did it anyway, and I'll argue about the protocol later if anyone asks. I put Kethvari's assessment in and Akafer's debrief and the transcript of the question Vasquez asked Vrethak and the 23 seconds of silence that followed. The 4-minute gap in my logs is still there. I decided not to fill it, which some things are better documented by the absence. There are things I don't know how to put in the report. I don't know how to document what it looks like when a species has already decided an outcome, and everything you read as hesitation is actually logistics. The Dreth models were measuring delay. The delay looked like negotiation, which they were wrong about what they were measuring. I don't know how to document a medic brought on a boarding team or a 4-degree heading adjustment, made in a hazard field, or 4 minutes of silence in a log from someone who timestamps everything. I don't know how to document Vasquez standing at a viewport saying 14 hours is a long time to be 4 years old. What I can document, and what I want very clearly in this record, for anyone who reads it after me, is that the behavioral models are going to be revised. They have to, I guess, be, which the Dreth have already begun their review. Accord Command has commissioned 2 separate working groups to assess interspecies response prediction frameworks. There will be meetings. There will be new projections and new models. I want the new models to include Brathella's formulation, not as a formal parameter, just as a note somewhere, a reminder that someone who was watching closely enough got there first. Recommend against interpreting the waiting as patience. I want the new models to ask the question Vasquez asked, not the legal question, not the strategic question. Did anyone think about what it would be like? I want that question in every model we build from here on. I want it in the framework before anyone runs the projections, before anyone calculates acceptable stress levels for short-duration separation, before anyone decides something is a reasonable cost. Did anyone think about what it would be like? I'm filing this report at 23:58, plus my coffee is cold. The Accord's working groups will meet for the first time in 12 days. The Colonial Charter Review is scheduled for next quarter. The Kepler margin dispute will continue for years, probably these things do. In 6 months I'll almost certainly be assigned to document something else. Something with different parameters, different species, different tactical frameworks. The incidents accumulate, the logs grow. You find the categories that fit and you put things in them, and occasionally you leave a 4-minute gap that you can't quite explain. The Tharsis Ridge departed the relay station this morning. I watched it go on the external sensors. It had a tertiary thruster again. They'd done repairs during the 9 days apparently. It looked the same as any other patrol frigate, slightly scarred and workmanlike. I watched until I couldn't see it anymore. Then I logged the time, noted that my coffee was cold, and went to file the report. Somewhere in the Kepler margin, 11 children are with their families. The little one's okay. I want that in the record.